You are listening to the Composing Trust podcast by Culture Solutions, a series on European cultural action with the world. Is Europe still attractive? How is it perceived outside the EU? How do Europeans promote culture together in the world and with which partners? What have they learned together? What is their experience? Our Composing Trust podcast series will address these issues. Welcome to you all. My name is Damien Helly, the co-author of this Composing Trust series by Culture Solutions. Because trees are so important for climate, we are trying to understand how the practices of agroforestry interact with culture, both as a set of worldviews and as artistic forms of expression. In our first episode, we explore the question of cultural perceptions of trees and agroforestry within various societies. And today, with this second episode, we will investigate the connection between science and the arts in agroforestry and what kind of opportunities it opens for EU international cooperation and cultural relations. In this episode, we hear four practitioners who are dealing with trees from a combined scientific and artistic perspective. Maya Marshak from South Africa has a PhD in environmental studies and she uses artistic practices in her research. Patrick Worms, a Cambridge-educated geneticist, is the president of the International Union of Agroforestry. Based in Brussels, he has a refined knowledge of EU policies. Francesca Camilli is a biologist working in Florence, Italy. She is the vice president of the European Agroforestry Federation, EURAF, and passionate about the connections between the arts and agroforestry. She is also a member of an association called Café Scienza. Zayaan Khan is an agroecology and cultural professional based in Cape Town, South Africa. There is also a brief quote by Method Gundidza, who was featuring in a previous podcast. What struck me first when listening to Maya, Zayaan, Francesca and Patrick was that they all describe agroforestry as some kind of lost cultural heritage.
Agroforestry has a different translation. In Italian, at least, it is a quite recent combination of word agro, which stands for agriculture, and forestry. And this word indicates a set of agricultural practices which are still common in many parts of the world nowadays, but that all across Europe are almost disappeared. They have been abandoned, and so we have to find them if we want to have a look at them. So it's very interesting for me to ask myself, to ask ourselves, what is left of the past agroforestry today? What has been lost and what can be recreated, can be designed again.
Maya Marshak has carried out research on the disappearance of insects because of industrialized agriculture. She used arts to reimagine disappeared creatures, a bit like rediscovering ghosts, she said.
For the maize research, we produced an animation in collaboration with the sound artist Cara Stacy. We recorded the soundscapes from both agroecological maize fields and then commercial maize fields, which were grown in an industrial way. Then she worked with that sound to create a soundscape from this very biodiverse soundscape to this very more quiet soundscape. And using the archival materials I'd collected of insects, I imagined insect diversity of what would have existed and what existed in agroecological spaces and then what exists in those more degraded industrial landscapes where there was only one or two species left.
Patrick gives his view on the reasons why this cultural heritage loss took place and what it led to.
We have to remember that for the past 3 centuries or so, at least in Europe, we have aggressively encouraged clever young people to leave the country and move to the city, to be educated at universities and take non-farm related jobs. that has had very pernicious impacts on the culture of the natural world, because it has put in place a value judgment that if you are a lawyer, say, operating in a glass tower in a big city, you're worth more than if you are a farmer operating somewhere in the countryside. And when that is repeated generation after generation, people internalize this sense of inferiority. And that sense of inferiority is what is destroying landscapes.
In parallel to the destruction of landscapes described by Patrick, other destructions dynamics have been at play with colonisation, the consequences of which Zayaan is dealing with in her work.
We also come out of, or we're in, let me say, it hasn't left us really. Over 500 years of colonization, of very brutal colonization that has decimated and severed so much of our culture and so much of our knowledge systems. And so I have a skill or a calling to kind of not so much mend that, but to really look at where our survivalism and how we engage with land has been broken by that detrimental kind of colonial intrusion, and how we're able to reconnect those things. And for me, agroecology is a beautiful way to do that.
Zayaan said it is a beautiful way to do that, echoing Patrick's words on the linkages between truth and beauty.
The reason why combining arts and sciences makes sense, especially in the context of agriculture, is because of something very odd but very reassuring that scientists across a range of disciplines have discovered over the past century or so. And that is something that you cannot prove through a scientific method, but that many scientists feel in their very bones. There is beauty in truth. If something is beautiful, it is more likely to be truthful. If something is ugly, it is less likely to be truthful. Beauty is a word that will often be used by mathematicians. And in the same way, beauty is a word that is used by people who fight for a better environment. They may not say so in public because we're all supposed to be worried about money and about efficiency and such things. But in practice, the reason why somebody gets out of bed in the morning and militates for a national park or to protect the elephant or to protect the Amazon is also because they find these environments or these creatures to be particularly beautiful.
I see it as something I'm always learning about. I think even, in school, I was interested in biology and interested in art. Those were my favorite subjects. And I kind of intuitively knew they were connected, or knew an interest in the environment. And I think I so recently finished my PhD, and I think this question of like, how do the arts and the science relate, and how can I work in that in-between space, was very much a question throughout that work of learning, what am I doing? I didn't really know where I was going with it. It was just about being curious, collecting images, stories, sharing those with the people that I interviewed, and kind of seeing how that opened up new conversations.
Both Patrick and Maya, the connection between science, aesthetics, and the arts is like an obvious mystery. In Patrick's case, artwork is even used to engage scientists on sensitive or complex topics.
If you're finding yourself in an environment filled with hardcore scientists who have not looked at ecology, but are instead agronomists or geneticists or financial engineers, you tell them about the benefits of agroforestry. An easy way of doing that is first to show them some pictures, because you know that as people who evolved in a landscape dotted with trees, these are pictures that are going to speak to them subconsciously, but that are going to speak to them. And using those pictures, and they could be artworks, they could be photographs, they could be something else, will open up the conversation beyond the antagonistic one of, for example, organic versus petrochemical agriculture, but towards one which is far more interesting, which is that, right, how can we use all of the tools we have today together with the tools that the science of ecology is teaching us are so very important, such as agroforestry?
There's indeed something about methods using arts to pursue scientific goals, as Maya described.
The more and more I work with other artists who also work in that space, the more I realize that it is in a way about method, about the mode of inquiry or it being engaged in a space. So I think coming from a research kind of academic background, there's often a kind of a set of tools that you use to interviews and methods. For example, I took lots and lots of photographs and then would discuss those photographs with the people I interviewed. Sometimes those were photographs of things I found in the archives or things I found within research and development kind of laboratories, things that were hidden under the desk that hadn't been looked at for 20 years, maybe a catalogue or a field notebook or some old entomology connections. So I think it is just sort of looking for things out of a place of curiosity.
Speaking of methods, our other guest, Francesca, tells us about her experience of using paintings in her research.
Been working on different projects regarding rural development, dealing with natural resources and agricultural resources, trying to understand if it is possible to recreate local supply chain. And when you study them, so you need also to understand how these resources have been considered in history. And in some way, this approach also has brought me to look at paintings or at old pictures, for example. And when I look at them, I don't just try to see what is in the foreground, but also to understand what is in the background. Even though, as I said, I'm not an art historian, many times it can happen that there are some representations which have nothing to do with the reality at that time. So we have also to be very careful.
I asked Francesca to give us more detailed examples of paintings she had been interested in to understand how arts and science could help each other. And what she came up with were her webinars during the COVID pandemic and called Science in Arts.
We wanted just, let's say, integrate art and science. So we call these webinars La Scienza nell'Arte, that means science in art. And we invited some experts in different disciplines to talk about what we could appreciate in paintings through science. So botanists or meteorologists or expert in soil sciences or in forestry and astronomy. Many people followed us and they appreciated the approach because sometimes we look at paintings without knowing some representation of the vegetation or natural phenomena, which are not explained from people who are competent in art history because they don't have scientific knowledge about that. So they were quite much appreciated and also from tourist guides.
A more recent examples of her exploration includes the discovery of 17th century botanical models made of wax.
These are some wax botanical models, which are at the Museum of Botany of the University of Florence. These artists manufactured these wax botanical models promoted by the Grand Duke Peter Leopold of Lorraine because he wanted them to be an educational tool. These artisans or artists, they used to just reproduce the real model that many explorers at that time brought to Italy and that they were planted and nobody knew at that time. So this was another way to use art in the time to make people know about natural sciences.
Since we're recording this podcast, some of these wax models are now exhibited in the Florence Scientific Museum. Francesca had another story of collaboration between artists and scientists around the work of painter Bartolomeo Bimbi.
Some years ago, we organized a meeting with two botanists and an art historian, and they talked to the public about this amazing description of fruits made by a painter called Bartolomeo Bimbi, who lived in between 1600 and 1700. So I used to paint all these different kinds of apples, pears, and figs, and plums, and cherries, and grapes, and citrus. But the special thing is that he reported each type of these different cultivars on scrolls painted in the same painting. So these are painted databases of what they used to grow at that time, what they used to cultivate. I think this is a good marriage between art and science.
Bimbi's gigantic paintings can be seen at the Museum of Still Life at Villa Medicea di Poggio in Prato near Florence. These examples from old Europe are quite clear about the blurred boundaries between arts and science, and also between scientific disciplines. I asked our podcast participants how they view multidisciplinary approaches in agroforestry and agroecology. Patrick approached the question from the angle of beauty and truth over history. He also values the role of artists in representing landscapes.
Now, as it happens, in the context of agriculture, beauty is a surprisingly accurate proxy for truth, in the sense that a landscape with trees, an agroforestry landscape, will seem to us to be much more beautiful than a landscape comprised only of large fields of a single crop. And it also turns out scientifically that those landscapes are more efficient, more productive, more resilient. They lock more carbon. They host more biodiversity. They give us more of the things that science tells us are important for our thriving on this planet. That is also why artists are such useful allies of a better agriculture, because it is artists who have, across the centuries, painted and recorded what today we call agroforestry.
For Francesca, agroforestry requires an integrated approach combining several disciplines.
Agroforestry can be defined as culture, as it is an example of complex integration of different disciplines, going from natural sciences to social sciences to humanistic disciplines. What also pushed me to an interdisciplinary approach to study the agricultural landscape. It was a book which is entitled Storia del paesaggio agrario italiano, which in English is History of the Italian Agricultural Landscape. This book was written by Emilio Sereni, who was an historian, and this interdisciplinary characterization of the rural life involves economic and social history, linguistics, archaeology, and art history, so it's multidisciplinary.
Zayaan Khan, as a cultural practitioner, insists on a significant nuance between multi- and transdisciplinary approaches.
Yes, it is multidisciplinary, but what I've recently learned is that it's much more transdisciplinary. The subtle difference is that it combines all of those things, and it's sometimes science, but it's also art, you know? It blurs those boundaries, and it brings more allowance, because oftentimes the story that needs to be told feels like it's coming through me as opposed to me kind of, making things happen. You get into the zone, you tell the story. It's about healing, it's about community, it's about the collective.
At the end of this journey, I asked our guests which takeaways they wanted to share with our podcast followers, and also what the EU and its member states could do to bring added value in this space where agroforestry, science, and culture meet.
People really want to talk to one another because you always come away with a new perspective, and people are able to answer something that's been bugging them. It opens a vessel into a new way of working so that the crux of a lot of that situation that they may have been struggling with, sometimes for years, is able to flow better, to answer better. I think we get so stuck in our silos and we work within such a strange kind of capitalistic notion of time these days. It's hard to break out of that. And so these opportunities really offer kind of fodder for future freedoms in work and answers, solutions.
So the most important thing that the EU could do would be to encourage the cultural institutions of its member states to give more credence to cultural works coming from the countryside, to give more value to cultural works coming from the countryside. That means no doubt that you are going to have all sorts of things coming up, including things that are going to be deeply inimical to a more natural way of judging agricultural landscapes. But it is out of that dialogue between different ways of looking at the world and between different ways of perceiving the world that truth will arise. And as we know, truth and beauty have very many things in common.
We've seen a lot of reparation lately, and it's been remarkable. I don't know if it's fast enough, and especially, for example, with the movement of museums reconciling stolen artifacts. Yes, we can talk about, the changing of the policy. I used to do that lobbying work, and I know how hard it is, and I know how much it can make you sick working so hard when nothing changes. Releasing some euros really helps with that. Sometimes it's very little money, but it also allows us to do the work that is really important, especially if it's kind of targeted around a specific theme or a question. Artists really have a way to find solutions in these scenarios, this kind of agroforestry culture nexus.
I think this interdisciplinary approach must be considered at different levels, both policy level at educational level, formal and informal, and at a research level. So I think this is something that the institutions should consider. Also, when developing programs, that would like it to become also a real project in the future.
With new security emergencies on the EU agenda and the backlash on the EU Green Deal, there's a long way before we see new European initiatives mixing agroforestry and cultural relations. At Culture Solutions, we will continue developing transdisciplinary partnerships on culture and science diplomacy to understand how best EU policies can jointly deliver scientifically relevant, creative, climate and biodiversity actions. And let's finish this episode with a quote by Method Kunditsa.
Decolonizing our minds to redefine the correct relationship of us as people to plants and to the greater spectrum of life.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of our Composing Trust podcast by Culture Solutions. If you liked it, you can subscribe and follow us on your favorite podcast platforms and contact us at culturesolutions.eu.